Greetings and welcome back for another installment of our journey through the Bible in a year and a half here at Asbury Broadneck United Methodist Church in Annapolis, Maryland. I'm Pastor Tillett, and I welcome you to our discussion this week about the Gospel of Mark. Last week we were in Matthew. This week we are in Mark, the second gospel of the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospel of Mark was named after its author, John Mark, who was a disciple of the Apostle Peter and spent some time in ministry with the Apostle Paul. He's closely associated with Peter and has traditionally been seen as the author of this gospel. It is also noteworthy that Mark and Luke were not written by men who had been disciples of Jesus Christ, who after his resurrection were referred to as the apostles. And then, of course, the Apostle Paul, who was not one of Jesus' disciples, but encountered Jesus, or Jesus encountered him on the road to Damascus, and he became known as the Apostle Paul. So Mark was not a disciple, but he was a follower of, and dare we say, a disciple of Peter after the death and resurrection of Christ. So for the historical setting, Mark may have been composed in the late 50s or early 60s AD. And this gospel reflects the personal reminiscences of the Apostle Peter. Mark was probably not an eyewitness during Jesus' ministry. The theme, the gospel conveys a sense of urgency, wherein everything takes place immediately. Throughout the gospel, there's a decided theological emphasis on the necessity of the Son of Man who must suffer. So he's moving fast. He's accomplishing a lot. The word immediately is used frequently. And there's also the theological emphasis on the necessity for the Son of Man, who is Jesus Christ, to suffer. The gospel, according to Mark, is commonly thought to have been the first written of the gospels in the New Testament. Mark presents Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of God. And his ministry was characterized by a succession of mighty works to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, and were signs of the presence of God's power and kingdom. Now, most scholars believe that Mark is the oldest, the first of the four Gospels, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a major source. A comparison of the four Gospels reveals that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are noticeably similar, while John is quite different. The first three Gospels agree extensively in language and in the material they include, and then the order in which the events and sayings from the life of Christ are recorded. And because of this agreement, these three books are called the Synoptic Gospels, which in the Greek means seeing together. Just a mathematical, if you will, comparison of Mark to Matthew and Luke indicates that 91% of Mark's gospel is contained in the Gospel of Matthew, and 53% of Mark's gospel is found in the Gospel of Luke. The gospel is largely a collection of narratives that depicts Jesus as being almost constantly active. A favorite word used in Mark is the adverb immediately, which is used at least 16 times. Mark also records fewer words of Jesus than does any of the other Gospels. The main divisions in the book, the Gospel, can be characterized and captured this way. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 13, opening events of Jesus' public life. So there's no birth narrative. They get right into him as an adult and his public life. 1:14 through 9:50, Jesus preaching, teaching, and healing in Galilee, his ministry. Chapter 10 focuses on the journey to Jerusalem as he is approaching the end of his public ministry and the end of his life on earth. Chapters 11 through 15 cover the last week of Jesus' life, including his crucifixion and burial, and then chapter 16 addresses the resurrection with some final marching orders to the disciples. The recipients of Mark's gospel were probably at a congregation in Rome, or at least it was directed to Gentile readers. So that while Jesus was the son of David, the Son of God, and came born as a Jew to Jewish people, that it was also made clear that his ministry was not just restricted to or limited to the Jews, but was also available to the Gentiles as well. It may have been associated, may have also been an occasion by the persecution of the Roman Church between 64 and 67 AD. And the famous fire in Rome in 64 AD was probably set by Nero Caesar himself, but was blamed on Christians, resulting in widespread persecution. And that just seems to be a theme that humanity follows from one era to the next, one kingdom to the next, etc., is the felt need to demonize somebody, to blame somebody and make them the enemy, so that the Romans under Nero Caesar made the Jews an object of hate and a target for persecution and even death. And then if we go to, say, Nazi Germany from 1933, after Hitler's election as chancellor, through 1945, they target the Jews. And some might say some of that kind of targeting is happening now, that though we are people of the Judeo-Christian tradition, some people who claim to be Christians seem to have forgotten what the Bible says about God's love for widows and orphans and provision for them, and God's love and care and concern for strangers and foreigners. So it happened then. We kind of see it happening now, unfortunately. But the great fire in Rome in 64 AD was blamed on the Christians, even though they had nothing to do with it. There were several special points of emphasis I'd like to highlight briefly in the Gospel of Mark. The first is the cross, both the human cause and the divine necessity. The human cause being the temple authorities who resented Jesus and the fact that he was favorably received by the people because he taught as one with authority and not as they were perceived to be. And then, of course, the divine necessity that in order for there to be victory over sin and death and the grave, Jesus had to die bearing the sins of the people and then resurrect with victory and all power in his hand. So a point of emphasis was the cross. Special attention should also be paid to the passages on discipleship that arise from his predictions of his passion in Mark 8:34 through 9:1, 9:35 through 10:31, and 10:42 to 45, the passages on discipleship. The teachings of Jesus although Mark records fewer actual teachings of Jesus, fewer actual words of his than other gospel writers, there is a remarkable emphasis on Jesus as teacher. And so we hear him referred to, the words teacher, teach, or teaching, or rabbi are applied to Jesus 39 times in the Gospel of Mark. So clearly there was a focus and emphasis on teaching. Then there's the messianic secret. On several occasions, Jesus warns his disciples or the persons for whom he has performed a miracle to keep silent about who he is and what he's done. And he would often say or tell the disciples, my time has not yet come. It's not yet. You can't tell this yet, which is interesting because if you were somebody who was blind and now you can see, deaf and now you can hear, lame and now you can walk, demon possessed and now you are sane and clothed and in your right mind, you want to tell somebody. Although Jesus did tell, after he healed Legion, the man filled with many demons, that he told him, go back to your family and tell them what the Lord has done for you. And it says that he goes and not only tells his family, who had left him out there in the cemetery, because I guess with his demon possession, he'd become unmanageable. He tells his family, but not only his family, but also it says many around the Decapolis, the 10 cities. But there would be this messianic secret. Yes, I've healed you, but don't say anything. As if people wouldn't notice, hey, weren't you blind yesterday? I'm sorry, you can hear me now? There was also Jesus as the Son of God. Although Mark emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, he also does not neglect his deity, and so we'll often refer to him as the Son of God. A key verse in the Gospel of Mark is Mark 10:45, which says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So he's the king, but he didn't come here for you all to bow down to him, but he came here to serve others, to serve us. And no clearer example of that servanthood is expressed than what we see in the Gospel of John, when on the evening of the Last Supper, that it says he took off his outer garment, wrapped the towel around his waist, and got on his knees and washed his disciples' feet. So he did not come to be served, but to serve. I think we in the Church of Jesus Christ would do well to remember the Messiah that we say we love and serve, and be a lot less about, "Ooh, look at me, I'm this person, this title, I'm wonderful." No, we're here to serve. We're not doormats, but we are here to serve. He's also, continuing with the theme of service, his role as servant, as the Messiah. Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament by coming to earth. He did not come as a conquering king. He came as a servant to help mankind by telling us about God and healing us. Even more, by giving his life as a sacrifice for our sins, he engaged in the ultimate act of sacrifice. So we see him as, we see the focus on the cross, on discipleship, on the teachings of Jesus, on the messianic secret, on Jesus as the Son of God, and then Jesus as a servant. And finally, there's also a focus on the miracles that he performs. Mark records more of Jesus and his miracles than his sermons. And Jesus is clearly a man of power and action, not just words. Jesus did miracles to convince the people who he was and to teach the disciples his true identity as God, and also to help redirect the attention of people from the things of this earth to the things of God, and that God sees you, he knows you, he's concerned about you, he knows what you're going through, and provides remedy through me, through Jesus Christ, for what ails you. Spreading the gospel, Jesus directed his public ministry to the Jews first. But when the Jewish leaders opposed him, Jesus also engaged the non-Jewish world through healing and preaching, the Gentiles. Roman soldiers, Syrians, and other Gentiles heard the good news, and many believed and followed him. And Jesus' final message to his disciples challenged them to go into all the world and preach the gospel of salvation. In Mark chapter 16, in the final verses, it reads as thus: "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. And these signs, this evidence, this manifestation, these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well." So the ministry that Jesus performed during his life, those acts and that power and the miracles are accessible and available to us today as we immerse ourselves in our relationship with the Lord and follow him, that we can drive out demons and place our hands on sick people and they'll get well. I'm grateful to God for this opportunity to serve, to be used as a vessel, as a vehicle, as an instrument, not for self-elevation, but for ministry to and loving on and serving God's children and God's people. God bless you. Lord willing, we'll see you next week for the next installment as we spend some time in the Gospel of Luke.